Welcome back to Dark Corner's Classics. Dracula Untold was set to be the first film of Universal's integrated horror universe franchise before it lead-ballooned its way out of contention. But perhaps The Mummy was always a better choice, because it is so much less well known. That unfamiliarity invites reinvention. Even in its own franchise, The Mummy stood apart, strange and unique. In 1932, Universal Studios was looking to continue their horror cycle and find a vehicle for Frankenstein star Boris Karloff. The first project announced was Cagliostro, based on the life of a mystic who claimed to be 3,000 years old. In a story written by Nina Wilcox Putnam, the character would invent a radio-television death ray. But studio head Carl Laemmle found this too science fiction and preferred to delve into history, with Dracula screenwriter John Balderston taking the lead, still using elements of Putnam's proposed story.
Permit me to present you with the most sensational find since that of Tutankhamun.
The Mummy was an obvious choice. Although Tutankhamun's tomb had been opened 10 years ago, the removal of items had only been completed recently and public interest was still strong. There had been mummy stories as early as 1827 in The Mummy, a tale of the 22nd century by Jane C. Loudon, possibly the first story to feature a mummy's curse, as well as Bram Stoker's 1903 book The Jewel of Seven Stars. There was also a 1911 film by the Tannhauser Company, in which a mummy is resurrected Frankenstein style using electricity, and Ernst Lubitsch had directed The Eyes of the Mummy in 1918, starring Pola Negri and Emil Jannings. This pedigree of a familiar title that was still something audiences had never seen before was fast becoming Universal's speciality. There was never any question about who would play the Mummy. In the year since Frankenstein had been released, Karloff had gone from bit player to headliner. But who would direct? Karl Freund might seem an odd choice for so important a film, as he had never directed before, but as a cameraman he had one of the most impressive CVs in Hollywood. He had lensed Dracula for Todd Browning, and in his native Germany he had worked on Paul Wegener's Golem, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, and F.W. Murnau's The Last Laugh. His use of the moving camera in the latter film had been very influential. And some of the most effective moments in The Mummy find the camera, operated by Charles J. Stumer, another silent film veteran, creeping through the atmospherically lit sets. The other vital addition to the team was makeup supremo Jack Pierce, whose Frankenstein makeup had contributed so much to that film's success.
Never saw a mummy like that.
Neither I imagine as anyone else.
For the mummy Im-Ho-Tep, whose name incidentally was borrowed from a pyramid architect, Pierce would create another iconic image. The makeup took 8 hours to apply, but at least Karloff didn't have to wear it long. What surprises most people viewing the film today is just how little Karloff's mummy is in the film. In the opening scenes, he is discovered by a team of archaeologists from the British Museum, one of whom unwittingly reads an ancient papyrus. The mummy wakes. Then we see his hand as he steals the parchment. That's it. Barely 30 seconds screen time. Given how brilliant the makeup is, it must have taken great restraint on Freund's part not to dwell on it, but he increases the horror immensely by instead focusing on the reaction of Bramwell Fletcher's Ralph Norton. We see a lot of screaming in horror films. Hysterical laughter was something new and gave the series its best known line.
He went for a little walk.
When we next see the mummy, 10 years have passed and it has assumed the identity of Ardeth Bay. Although it is the mummy that has become the iconic image, arguably Pierce's work here is even better. We know what a mummy looks like, so Pierce had something to work from, but a 4,000-year-old priest was something else, and the result works brilliantly when combined with Freund's lighting. The effect was achieved by using rubber collagen to pinch Karloff's skin into tiny wrinkles, an effective but painful process. Karloff bore it without complaint. He and Pierce were friends, and he knew how much he owed to the makeup man's genius.
The best makeup man in the world.
Thank you.
I owe him a lot.
Ardeth Bey dominates his scenes, an ominous, stick-thin figure seeming to tower over everyone around him. Although Karloff himself was only 5'11", a testament to Freund's clever staging, as well as Karloff's mesmerising performance. As a story, The Mummy drew on Universal's previous successes. Helen's illness is straight out of Dracula.
These impulses to go to him, the pull is too strong to withstand and live.
And, like the Frankenstein monster, the Mummy is not an unthinking psychopath.
No man ever suffered as I did for you.
He is a thwarted lover with a tragic backstory conveyed by a lavishly staged flashback to ancient Egypt. In life, Im-Ho-Tep was in love with Princess Anck-Son-Amon. After her unexpected death, he tries to resurrect her using forbidden texts.
I dared the god's anger
But is caught in the act
and found me doing an unholy thing.
and sentenced to be mummified alive. It's telling that the most horrifying moment in the film and the whole series happens not to one of the mummy's victims, but to the villain himself.
Looks as though he died in some sensationally unpleasant manner.
There is an implication that through his obsession and this inhuman punishment, Im-Ho-Tep has been driven mad over the centuries.
The ancient rites must be performed over thy body.
Originally, the film was to have featured multiple flashbacks showing many different resurrections of Anck-Son-Amon.
Until I send back your spirit that has wandered through so many forms and so many ages.
Including a Roman, a Viking, and a medieval maid. And the character of Saxon warrior remains in the opening credits, showing how late in the day the change was made. These sequences were shot but discarded.
Where are we?
Choosing instead to focus on the princess's final reincarnation as Zita Johann's Helen Grosvenor.
Do you have to open graves to find girls to fall in love with?
Johann was a theatre actress who despised film, but was quite fond of the paycheck. She also hated Freund.
Besides, I don't like the feeling that I'm always being watched.
However, she was ideal casting, as she genuinely had a deep belief in reincarnation and the mystical. The film also featured Universal stalwart Edward Van Sloan,
The viscera were not removed.
adding Dr. Muller to a CV that already included Professor Van Helsing and Frankenstein's Dr. Waldman. The film didn't reach the financial heights of Dracula or Frankenstein, but was still a big success, and yet, unlike those films, did not get a sequel. This may be partly due to the nature of The Mummy. In his book, Classics of the Horror Film historian William K. Everson points out that he is not a particularly menacing figure.
Good heavens, what a terrible curse.
Stiffened with age and hampered by bandages, he is so slow-moving that escaping his clutches is child's play.
We Egyptians are not permitted to dig up our ancient dead.
Universal had sidestepped that problem by disposing of the mummy itself early on,
What became of the mummy of Im-Ho-Tep?
and focusing instead on the undead romance. In fact, there's a good case to be made that, although it's Karloff's face on the poster, the mummy of the title refers to that of Anck-Son-Amon, as it's she who is the focus of Ardeth Bey's obsession. With Im-Ho-Tep's mummy resurrected and him returned to death at the end of the film, a straight sequel would have been ridiculous, and so Im-Ho-Tep remained at rest until Stephen Sommers' 1999 remake, which took the same basic story and turned it into an action-adventure. But while there is only one Frankenstein and one Dracula, Egypt is full of mummies.
We've stumbled on something that's going to make us rich and famous.
In the late 30s, Universal was in financial difficulties and began to resurrect some of its horror characters, starting with Son of Frankenstein, and reinvent others, like Lon Chaney's Wolfman, a film that has nothing to do with 1935's Werewolf of London. The Mummy fell into this latter category, and the story was reinvented for a film about a new mummy named Caris that made no reference to the original.
Swell, let's get going.
Or at least no direct reference.
Behold, over 3,000 years ago, the Princess Ananka died.
This reused footage from the 32 film is crowbarred into 1940's The Mummy's Hand, with Western star Tom Tyler stepping in whenever you might have glimpsed Karloff's face. The comparison doing no favours to Tyler's acting.
Caris was condemned to be buried alive.
Tyler got the role thanks to a physical similarity to Karloff, but he makes a decent mummy, despite the arthritis that had ended his career as a leading man. Jack Pierce's makeup is different but still effective. although much less well lit, and a new trick added to the monster's appearance. The blackened eyes are not contact lenses, but where the negative has been scratched, a painstaking but effective process. As in the Karloff film, Tyler's mummy is largely absent, with a high priest being the main bad guy.
Not one of you who tried to enter the tomb of Ananka will leave this valley alive.
But in this case, the priest is a separate character, played by George Zucco, and the mummy remains a mummy throughout. Again, the mummy is driven by the love of a princess, this time named Ananka. And again he is buried alive, although that's still Karloff you can see, with an added twist.
It's a pulse beat.
Karis remains alive and can be brought back to activity via tanner leaves, which became a MacGuffin for all future films.
Keep him away from it!
Despite the plot, the tragic romance is never explored, and the film spends less time on horror than it does on comedy.
Yeah, it reminds me of somebody. I just can't remember who right now.
And magic tricks.
Stupendous news. Colossal surprise.
The tragic character of the last film is gone.
Should Caris obtain a large amount of the fluid, he would become an uncontrollable monster, a soulless demon with a desire to kill.
Reducing the mummy to little more than a murder weapon wielded by Zucco's Andoeb.
Kill wherever you find the fluid.
An awkward plot contrivance, given that the heroes are out in the middle of nowhere and there's nothing to stop Andoeb and his minions killing them by some simpler means. And while the 32 film had drawn on Universal's previous successes, The Mummy's Hand goes one step further, referencing Dracula,
Children of the night.
Frankenstein,
He's alive.
and even the Wolfman.
Will Karis be kept alive by the tanner leaves during the cycle of the full moon?
At the end, Zucco's high priest is killed, while Karis suffers a fate to which mummies are a bit susceptible. Looking at the grandiose set in which the climax takes place, you might imagine that The Mummy's Hand enjoyed a sizable budget, but the set was left over from Green Hell, an adventure film starring Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and directed by Frankenstein's James Whale. Elsewhere, the set actually comes apart. In fact, while Frankenstein had 3 reasonably well-budgeted sequels and Dracula 2, The Mummy went straight into B-movies, entertaining enough for what they are, but barely over an hour long and cut price. Problems that would become still more evident in the next film.
Oh, it's just like a woman when the shooting's all over and everything's take, they pass out.
1942's The Mummy's Tomb is notable for being the first film of the franchise in which a mummy's tomb does not actually feature. Instead, the plot relocates to America.
The facts are here and we've got to face them. A creature that's been alive for over 3,000 years is in this town.
Eliminating the expense of sets or locations and the clunkiness of stock footage.
At least I have the satisfaction of having destroyed a terrible monster.
The film is set 30 years after The Mummy's Hand and starts with the hero of that film, Dick Foran's Steve Banning, recounting his story in a previously on The Mummy style flashback that takes up a sixth of the film's brief runtime.
Am I boring you, Mrs. Evans?
Oh, not at all.
While later in the movie, shots from Frankenstein are edited into the torch-wielding mob. As a direct sequel, The Mummy's Tomb had the opportunity to rekindle our attachment to characters in The Mummy's Hand.
And if Marta were alive today, she'd tell you the same thing.
So much for the heroine. And the hero and sidekick follow in short order, leaving us 2 leads who were introduced incidentally and have little film left to come into their own. On the bad guy front, George Zucco apparently escaped death but not old age.
30 years ago, an infidel sought to destroy me.
And has trained up a fresh high priest.
Now I leave in your hands the curse of Amen-Ra and the destiny of Karis.
While Karis,
The fire that sought to consume Karis only seared and twisted and maimed.
which explains why he looks completely different and has put on a few pounds.
Karis still lives.
By 1943, Lon Chaney Jr. had already played the Wolfman and Frankenstein's monster. Now it was his turn to do the Mummy, a role which he hated. Limping slowly from strangling to strangling is not what an actor dreams of doing. For the first time, the mummy appears consistently throughout the film, but this is a mixed blessing. The reduced time and money of a B picture mean that Pierce's makeup has been greatly simplified. So Chaney appears to be wearing a mud pack, while a rubber mask was used in long shots, something that went against the grain for the perfectionist Pierce. More importantly, William K. Everson's disparaging comments about the mummy start to ring very true.
Death goes with you.
Karras is again used as a tool to reap vengeance on those who opened the tomb. And Banning's perplexingly Scottish sister.
That moment has now arrived.
It's unclear why that moment is now rather than at any other point in the last 30 years, and again you're forced to ask, was transporting a mummy from Egypt to the US the most efficient way to commit murder?
You mean to say you think a mummy's been doing all these murders around here?
At the end, the mummy again burns, which perhaps provides some small excuse for the title of the next film.
We will concern ourselves solely with the history of Egypt, and not with the more lurid and non-curricular subject of living mummies.
Of the three mummy films starring Lon Chaney Jr., 1944's The Mummy's Ghost is probably the strongest, but includes no ghost, mummy or otherwise, and does share some of the issues of the previous film. Originally, the mummy was simply to have appeared walking out of a wood, with no explanation for its reappearance, but director Reginald Leborg pressed for a prologue to explain, up to a point.
We know that he still lives.
The scene is almost identical to that in the mummy's tomb.
Now swear by the ancient gods of Egypt.
George Zucco indoctrinating the latest high priest, John Carradine.
I have answered your summons.
Karras's job this time is to bring the Princess Ananka's mummy back to Egypt, although he mostly just kills people. And when Karras and Carradine reach the princess...
By thy will, her soul has entered another form.
This is the first film since 1932 in which the heroine, Egyptian girl Amina, played by Ramsey Ames, is a reincarnation of an Egyptian princess.
Something happens to me when I think of Egypt.
And while it has little of the resonance of the original, it's a welcome return. A welcome absence is that this is the only one of the sequels not to make ample use of footage from previous movies, reusing only a couple of shots. There's also a nice line in ironic humour.
I believe maybe it was a man made up as a mummy.
Whatever has the full moon to do with it?
And the mummy even gets to show some human emotion. A scene that resulted in injury for Chaney, as the glass top of the display case had not been replaced with breakaway glass. The blood you can see on his chin here is real.
Go.
The most notable thing about The Mummy's Ghost is its ending. Throughout the film, Amina's encounters with Karras have changed her.
She's beautiful, Karras.
Note the Bride of Frankenstein hair streaks. In the final moments, those changes become more severe, as she re-mummifies into Ananka, finally reuniting Karras with his lost love, but taking the innocent Amina's life in the process. It's a unique ending for the series, an unusual one for any film in 1944, and it seems to have been written to draw a line under the franchise. But in the same year, Karras was back in The Mummy's Curse, a title that is more or less justified with one hastily shouted line.
The curse of Amun-Ra upon you, Ragab.
Time has once again moved on.
But it was 25 years past.
In fact, when you take into account all the time that is supposed to have passed in the sequels, this is set in the mid-1990s.
Look, I've had enough argument for one day.
The plot is at least a little different. During an excavation in a Louisiana bayou, the body of Karras is uncovered.
Hey, looks like the imprint of a man's body.
Which is odd because the swamp he went into was in Massachusetts.
Crazy foolish!
He is swiftly contacted by a visiting archaeologist.
This is my colleague and associate, Dr. Ilzor Zandab.
Whose true identity would be shocking were he not wearing the standard evil fez worn by all previous high priests.
And any who would stand in your way, kill.
Ananka, meanwhile, struggles out on her own, with vague and conflicting memories of where she has come from and who she is.
I cannot remember who I am or what I'm doing here.
On the one hand, this is an interesting and original approach to the story.
It's as though I were Two different people.
On the other, nothing is made of the fact that this is Amina from The Mummy's ghost, albeit played by a different actress, and she presumably still has relatives living back home.
Sometimes I feel as if it's all part of a strange dream.
At the end, when she is remummified,
We'll put a crew of men to work digging Karis out of the rubble, then send them both back to the Scripps Museum.
well, won't that be nice for her parents? Having introduced this interesting rogue element, the writers failed to explore it in any way, instead falling back into familiar patterns.
Karis, you shall rise again to find your Princess Ananka.
So Karis is sent out to find the woman he was already buried with, killing anyone who gets in his way, and again proves himself inadequate to the task. Although there is at least an attempt at justifying this continued insistence on sending a mummy to do a man's job.
But it has been ordained that you must seek her out for yourself.
From a potentially interesting premise, this final entry in the canon returns to reused footage.
Over 3,000 years ago, the Princess Ananka died.
A mummy with a duff arm and gammy leg, which vanish as soon as he picks up a girl, and introduces some racist stereotypes for good measure.
The mummy's on the loose, he's dancing with the devil.
It is arguably the weakest of the sequels, and a good place to stop.
There's a certain secretary.
You're welcome to her, go ahead.
But like most Universal monsters, the Mummy got a coda, courtesy of a meeting with Abbott and Costello. Though even here it plays second fiddle. When they made Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, the idea of mixing the comedy duo with horror stars had seemed original. But 10 years later, the pair had met the Frankenstein monster, the Wolfman, Dracula, the Invisible Man, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the killer Boris Karloff. The Mummy was not so much original as inevitable. And it would not just be the end of the road for the monster.
The mummy of Clarice. Nobody could have a mummy like that.
Viewed today, Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy seems a decent example of their comedy.
Hey, the meat's on fire.
But at the time, it was their 36th film in just 16 years. Their 28th for Universal.
Something funny about this.
The performers were tired and their routines were exhausted.
Here, take your pick. There. Wait a minute, hold it. That's a shovel. Here's the pick over here.
Well, I picked the shovel. The shovel is my pick.
Oh, no, this is a pick. This is a shovel.
That's what I picked, is the shovel.
This would be the pair's last film for the studio, and their penultimate film together.
Come on, let's get out of here.
This mummy, now called Clarice, is played by Eddie Parker, Lon Chaney Jr.'s stunt double, getting his shot at the big time. In fact, he's barely on screen, which is probably to the good.
It's moving.
Is it now?
The rubber mask makeup by Bud Westmore is not terrible, but the costume is clearly an ill-fitting boiler suit with bandages sewn on.
Who the hell are these guys?
Universal would of course return to The Mummy with Brendan Fraser for a pair of entertaining outings and a third one.
Abominable snowman!
But you wouldn't really call them horror.
You lie.
I would never.
So, while the Tyler and Chaney incarnations have a creaky charm, the Boris Karloff film remains not just the gold standard for mummy films, but perhaps the only really good mummy-based horror Universal ever made.
The curse has struck her, and now through her, it will strike my son.
The only time that tricky subject matter was handled in a way that balanced an engaging story with genuine chills.
We must see each other again.
Like most of the best of the Universal horrors, it is a film that is more tragic than scary, that makes us feel sorry for the monster, even as we are relieved for those who escape him. By using the mummy so sparingly, the original allows Karloff's character the curse of humanity, a sense of what he has lost. Above all else, and a factor which sequels and remakes so often ignore, the mummy is a creature out of time, thousands of years from home. Whether maddened by the passage of centuries or angry at his undeserved fate, who can blame him for lashing out? For all its deficiencies as a threatening foe, there is something about the mummy that keeps drawing movie makers back. The romance and mystery of ancient Egypt, a culture so removed from our own that it might as well be another planet. Perhaps there are still great mummy stories to be told, ones that embrace the history to capture that atmosphere of another world. Perhaps those films will even be made by Universal. Who knows? Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this, check out other Dark Corners classics, and don't forget to subscribe.